This lecture is over using language to style a speech. Our focus here is on speech writing and speech writing ability, some of the different techniques for different types of speeches. First of all, language is a powerful tool. Language allows the audience to visualize something mentally that they've never seen with their eyes. You have a particular style that you use whenever you write and deliver a speech. Your style involves your word choices that help you achieve your goal. Rhetorical devices, which we have not discussed yet, but we will in this lecture. Rhetorical devices are techniques of language usage that are just one component of style. It's always worthy of note, worthy of remembering that when you do write speeches, when you write especially manuscripts, remember that those speeches are written for the ear. So they need to be written in spoken word and not academic language. So practice your drafts of your manuscripts out loud. Some tips for effective speech writing. You want to use words that are familiar both to you and to your audience. You want to avoid jargon when you can, or idioms. Remember, jargon is technical language. Idioms are turns of phrase that don't make literal sense, but we have a connotative meaning with them. You want to write easy to follow sentences. Typically, you want to write sentences that are short as well. You want to use repetition, repeating phrases or key words throughout the speech. You want to make sure that your transitions between points are clear. You need to have a clear organizational pattern to your speech, as we've discussed previously this semester. And you want to be prepared to adjust to feedback from your audience. This will be more difficult with some styles of speaking than others. Manuscript speaking, there's limited adjustment that we can make. But extemporaneous speaking and impromptu, we can adjust fairly easily without disrupting the flow of what we're doing. You want to strive for simplicity. Again, you want to choose simple language that's understood by all. When choosing between two synonyms or words that mean the same thing, go with the easier, simpler word. Don't try to impress anyone just with your vocabulary. Define necessary but unfamiliar terms such as jargon. Define them early, and if it's a long speech and you're using it frequently, you may want to define more than once. Overall, you want to be concise, using fewer words rather than more words to share your idea. Just because you talk longer doesn't mean it will leave any deeper of an impact. Again, you need to transition between major points, between your intro and the first point, between the last point and the conclusion. Transition words and phrases help the audience to follow your reasoning. They help the audience to stay engaged. So this is why we use transitions. A specific type of transitional phrase is called enumeration. Enumeration is when we use a number associated with the transition. So, as you see here, my first point, my second point, my third point, you hear those numbers. Those are unmistakable. The audience has a very clear idea of where we are within the speech. There are other types of transitions. I usually suggest the simple ones like enumeration, at least until you become a more advanced speaker. As I said earlier, language is powerful. And because language is powerful, we have to be careful of how we use it. There is biased language. Biased language is language that carries a connotation with it, so making stereotypes about a group's demographic characteristics. So you need to make sure you avoid negative references to a variety of different protected factors, or even just issues of religion or race or age, things that may not be protected by law, but at the very same time, you could violate an audience's trust, or they might just not like you anymore if you use too much in the way of biased language. So be cognizant of that. This can even come across into gendered language or the use of sexist pronouns inappropriately. And be careful about how you refer to people with disabilities. Remember that not all disabilities are visible, and so you need to be guarded and careful about how you refer to people with disabilities, always speaking of them with dignity and respect. Here we have a list of figures of speech, also known as rhetorical devices, also known as artistic devices. You need to be aware that they're called multiple things because they may show up as being referred to differently in this lecture as well as in your next exam. We'll look at each one of these on the following slides. We have repetition. Repeating important ideas infuses your speech with rhythm, or it can. When we do repetition artistically, that's when you really kind of strike a rhythm with repetition. Repetition in general aids in retention. Listeners retain information that they receive more than once. So when you begin your speech and you preview your thesis and main points, and then you cover your main points, and then you review your thesis and main points in the conclusion, you've repeated yourself 3 times at least. And that repetition helps the audience remember what your speech was about. Now, using it artistically, we have anaphora and alliteration. Anaphora is when a speaker repeats a word or phrase at the beginning of successive sentences or thoughts. For example, Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. I seriously doubt he entitled that speech, "I Have a Dream." But because he used that anaphora within the speech, it's what people remember. Alliteration is the repetition of the same sounds, usually hard consonants, in words or syllables in the same sentence. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. Lots of alliteration there. It's one of those things that stands out audibly, and it might help people remember a phrase if it's written as an alliteration. Now we come to what are called comparisons. 3 different kinds of comparisons. You have similes, which compares 2 things using like or as. You likely remember that from elementary school. Then we have metaphor, which compares 2 things by describing one thing as another. So you talk about one thing in terms of another. Oftentimes we use this as something that's just more visual or something that's more interesting. Analogies are similar to metaphor or simile. They compare unfamiliar concepts to something more familiar or more interesting. Typically, they're a bit longer and more encapsulated. Sometimes an analogy is kind of like a story. You want to avoid using metaphors or analogies or similes that are cliched, or in other words, they're so overused that they are boring to your audience. For example, sports metaphors are oftentimes overused. They're cliched. This graph might help you understand analogy, simile, and metaphor a little bit better. I will let you look over that. But the one thing that you can see where they all overlap is that they all compare two things. Then we have what's called personification. Personification is when you endow inanimate objects with human qualities or characteristics. One of my personal favorites in this list of examples here is technology hates me. I've said that I don't know how many times throughout my life. But it's to endow an inanimate object, something that's not alive, with human qualities or characteristics. It makes language interesting. There's nothing wrong with personification. It makes language interesting. Then you have the next one. We're creating a word that imitates a natural sound. This is called onomatopoeia. Another large word, onomatopoeia. As you can see the example there, they buzzed around her like bees. The word buzz is a word that imitates the natural sound of those rapidly beating bees' wings. Another figure of speech, you've got understatement, which draws attention to an idea by minimizing its importance. You've got hyperbole, makes an obvious exaggeration to make a point. Key there is that it's an obvious exaggeration. You don't expect anyone to believe you're being or trying to be accurate. A common hyperbole is, they brought everything but the kitchen sink. It's not a literal statement. Then you have allusion. Allusion makes a vague or indirect reference to people, historical events, or concepts to give them a deeper meaning. Often these are used whenever you're speaking to a crowd of people with which you have some history. Then we have irony. Why that came in last year, I don't really know why I set it up that way, but I did. Irony uses humor, satire, or sarcasm to imply a meaning other than what's actually being stated. So you say one thing, but you mean another. And there's different ways in which you can do it. Humor, satire, sarcasm. Be careful with irony, especially if you're talking to a crowd that may have an intercultural background. Humor, satire, and sarcasm do not translate well across languages and across cultures. So you may want to be careful about using irony unless you know the crowd very well. Now we move on and talk about different forms of delivery or methods of delivery. You see here the 4 basic forms: manuscript, oratory, impromptu, and extemporaneous speaking. We'll talk about each of those briefly. A manuscript speech is a speech that is read verbatim, or written out and read verbatim. Verbatim meaning word for word, an exact copy. Oftentimes when you see a political speech, it's written out as a manuscript. The downside is that it's going to restrict movement and eye contact with an audience. It will also restrict vocal variation. We oftentimes will fall into a reading voice whenever we're reading and that's all we're doing. Manuscripts are useful whenever precise wording is needed. If it's a legal proceeding that you're a part of and you need to make sure that your statement is just exactly right, then a manuscript is very important there. Other times, whenever it's an emotionally intense situation, then a manuscript may be useful. For example, eulogies. If you were delivering a eulogy, I would highly recommend writing a manuscript and reading it verbatim, because it helps you manage your emotions. A memorized speech, which is also known as oratory, is a speech that is spoken purely from memorizing a well-written speech. So you write a manuscript, and then you commit it to memory. Now, the great orators of the past, as you can see here, Plato, Aristotle, the Roman Senate, many others, their style was that of oratory. They would write speeches that were sometimes hours in length and then get up and deliver them to whatever audience. That was the expectation in that day and time. We do still use these on occasion, but typically for short speeches or portions of speeches. We just don't seem to memorize things as well as they used to in generations past. So we typically don't try to memorize long addresses. Then we have impromptu speaking. Impromptu literally means unpracticed, spontaneous, or improvised. So there's a lot of different situations in life where you might be called on suddenly to speak in front of a group of people. Maybe you didn't realize that your instructor was going to take today and call on members of the audience to explain things. Maybe you had a coworker that normally does the morning rally before you open the doors, and they called in sick this morning, and you're the next one in line. Suddenly you have a speech to give. Key thing here is not to panic. Organize your thoughts. Just share facts. Don't ramble all over yourself. Generally, you are asked to present material because you are the resident expert. You know what needs to be said. You know the content. And so you shouldn't have anything to really worry about. Just get your thoughts organized. And get in, get out with a few well-chosen remarks. Then we have what's called extemporaneous speaking. This is primarily the idea of what we've been doing all semester. This is somewhere between impromptu and manuscript or memorized. It's what's considered the most versatile type of speaking because you do have some of it written down, and then you also have the ability to make up some of it as you go along. You can stray from your organization a little bit if you need to dwell on a point longer than you had planned, or if you need to move on more quickly than planned, that's okay. You can't do that with a manuscript. You certainly don't want to do that with a memorized speech. But then you have the benefit of having things written down, sources, research, all of that you don't have the benefit of whenever you're doing impromptu speaking. With extemporaneous speaking, a good outline is your best friend. And this is second only to knowing your material. The idea of an extemporaneous outline is to keep you reined in. So whenever you write your outline, you're not going to write everything you know about the subject. You're only going to write about certain things. And then you have to train yourself that you are only going to talk about those certain things. You could talk all day long about the subject, but you only have time to talk about these specific things. That's the way an extemporaneous outline is meant to function.